G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. Today we're going through my team selection for the US Grand Prix. So as always, if you're new around here, you're enjoying the content, please throw some love the channel's way. We're getting very close to the 9,500 subscriber goal by the end of the year. So if you can help out with getting to that number, it would be greatly appreciated. How the team did in Singapore, 229 points, a very good weekend on all fronts for the most part for my F1 fantasy team. If you join me on my deadline stream before qualifying Saturday morning where I am, I wasn't really sure what direction my team was going in. There was clearly not a lot we could take away from the first two free practice sessions, and the third was going to be, as was usually the case, but even more so, a knee-jerk 1 hour of data to go off, and ultimately pulled the trigger on going down both the George Russell and Mercedes pairing. I know some people went just George Russell. I know some people just went Mercedes. I went both and proved to be the right call for my team. George obviously had a great free practice 3 after looking anonymous in the first 2 sessions, and then put it on pole position and won the race on Sunday. I also brought in Max Verstappen. He came away with 27 or 54 as my 2X driver. I also thought Max's momentum in the last couple of races at high-powered tracks, admittedly, would still translate through to how Singapore, would unfold. And Max's record there, still very well documented, still yet to win a race there, but back-to-back P2s at a track that's been his bogey track for the last couple of seasons. A very good result, and very confident that he can continue to get the job done as a 2X driver if you're not pulling with any McLaren assets in those same slots that, say, Max and George in this team occupy. So a great result for those two drivers, very much carrying the team there on the point scoring front for the 5 drivers. Sainz 8 points, Bortoleto -1, Gasly 2. Again, not much to say, kind of expected for all of these guys. Fascinatingly, the Williams pair of Sainz and Albon were both disqualified from qualifying. So they started with -5 on Sunday. And for Sainz to come from pretty much the back of the grid into the points, he finished on gross 13 points for the Grand Prix, but obviously the -5 from qualifying pulled that down just a little bit. But still a great result for him. Very happy with that performance from Carlos Sainz. And then 64 from McLaren, 67 from Mercedes. McLaren did well to bounce back from their disappointment in Baku. I very much expected them to be scoring kind of in the 60 to 80 point range. And it certainly could have been higher. I definitely was expecting more from both Piastri and Norris. But look, the fact that Norris landed on the podium, and that many people had Piastri as a 2X driver, which I didn't have, and he didn't finish on the podium, probably helped my team just a little bit. So a fortuitous slice of luck there, but I'll take it nonetheless. And then 67 points for Mercedes. Now, I do think a lot of that obviously pinned on the fact that George Russell won the race, and he had a fantastic weekend on all fronts. Kimi Antonelli qualified 4th, and I thought he would have done, exceptionally well to hold on to that or finish close to that place. He finished 5th, lost a position, but made an overtake, so he came out with 17 points, but very much helped Mercedes get to that 67 point mark, and they were the highest scoring constructor of the weekend, thanks to George's heroics. And then you put these two guys aside, Ferrari 48 points, Red Bull 51 points. So both teams, Ferrari and Red Bull, aside from obviously Max doing well, again, didn't do a whole lot. But I definitely thought the delta was going to be a lot larger, put it that way. But for Ferrari owners to come away with only 19 points less than Mercedes, I think that's not a bad outcome for people who are still running Ferrari. I think the narrative's slowly shifting away from Ferrari. They do seem to have a few gremlins in their closet right now, but as it stands, Mercedes, a great weekend for them on all fronts. So from where I was 2 weeks ago, just inside the top 8,000 with a successful final fix chip in Azerbaijan to a wild card in Singapore, feel like I've got a little bit of wind in my sails, and looking forward to carrying that into the upcoming sprint races slated. The most recent one coming in Austin in a couple of weeks' time at the time of recording. So hoping to build on that form, and 4 from 4 successful chips, I would say so far, just the autopilot and 3X left to play. And I definitely think there's a number of opportunities to use those in the coming weeks. So some takeaways from the weekend. Already talked about George Russell a little bit, but he is delivering on such a consistent basis. It is truly fantastic to see this kind of output from a driver that has probably flown under the radar, been maybe a little dismissed as an F1 fantasy asset because of, McLarens and Ferraris, etc., over the last couple months being potentially better. But George has definitely demonstrated now in Singapore, which again, they weren't expecting to do that well at, to be one of the most reliable in the game. If I can recall correctly, he's got something like 26 out of the last 28 races with double-digit F1 fantasy performances. And I think, again, in the 20s, mid to high 20s with the number of consecutive races completed. So he is a great asset to own right now. Does Mercedes pace translate to Coda? I don't know yet. I'm not going to 100% say it will. It's not really been their track quite as much as, say, McLaren, Ferrari, and Red Bull have over the last couple of years. But again, Mercedes did surprise us in Singapore. They weren't expected to do well there, and they came away with a first and a fifth. Anything's possible. So keep an eye on George. I think Kimi's a great alternative for lower budget teams as well. And I think that's kind of, even though they are delivering, I still think the second constructor with McLaren remains open to a certain extent. I mean, to the point around, obviously, all of those aforementioned teams being good at Coda. I think Mercedes certainly can take confidence from the weekend for sure. I think, again, though, much like Red Bull with that second driver, Kimi, the success of Mercedes hinges on Kimi. And Kimi had a great weekend in Singapore, one of his kind of most complete weekends in some time. It feels like they are, on paper, the second best constructor because Ferrari really have taken a step back. I'm just not sure what's going on with them. And then Tsunoda is, again, kind of the variable in that equation. We saw when he had a great weekend in Baku, Red Bull are becoming the highest scoring or close to the highest scoring constructor. But as soon as, and I'll just bring up the F1 Fantasy Tool statistics, when Yuki Tsunoda has a great weekend, like top 8 material, Red Bull can certainly win or be the highest scoring constructor. But then you fast forward to Singapore. Yes, it's a slightly more technical track, and Tsunoda had his work cut out for sure. But you can definitely see where Tsunoda does well versus where he's kind of just middle of the pack. And I think, again, Singapore was one of those weekends when Mercedes or Ferrari have one of those big weekends where both drivers are inside the top 5, then obviously they become that second highest scoring constructor with McLaren. But it wasn't really a weekend for Ferrari, and Tsunoda was kind of nowhere. So Mercedes, I think right now just feels like, and you look at their last couple of scores, we'll talk about them in just a little bit, good consistency that we're seeing from them at the moment. So a promising sign. I think it still is up for debate as to what the objectively best constructor is, but Mercedes at their price, their value, their recent results, I think there's a lot pointing in favor of them right now. Singapore, if you watched the race, I woke up for it, went straight back to sleep. It was not a entertaining affair whatsoever, in my opinion. I think the highlights were probably Fernando Alonso's radio messages or that first lap incident with Piastri and Norris. And for that reason, again, because it's not really a high overtake circuit, there are only 3 drivers with more than 5 overtakes. I just think that's kind of set the tone for what budget building looks like in the weeks going forward as well. And I'll bring up the budget builder on screen here just to give you a little bit of an insight into kind of what it looks like right now for the drivers and constructors. The B-tier driver category, probably the main focus for most of the budget building discussions on this channel, given the $0.6 million increases that they can fetch. Sainz, still carrying that 33 from Baku, that podium. That 8 in Singapore in the points again. I think he had a great result at Coda last year with Ferrari. I have every expectation he'll be featuring in the points this time around as well. It's a sprint race weekend too. So at minus 18 for a max rise, it's almost a no-brainer if you don't own him to get him in. Alonso, again, is probably the only new face in this category of budget drivers that have the lowest thresholds for a rise. Like Gasly, Colapinto, Lawson have all been there the last couple of weeks. The Alpine drivers, Gasly, Gasly I think is still my pick of the two, but it's fine margins. And then Lawson, he's driving all right. I think That 3 though in Singapore, it's probably nothing to get too excited about. As soon as 17 drops off his trailing average, he'll have obviously a much higher threshold to reach for a max rise. But Alonso, let's talk about him for a hot second, because heading into the deadline, there was some deliberation as to whether or not he was the right asset for our fantasy teams at 6.1 at the... Oh, no, it was 7.3 at the time. The problem was that even if he scored 35 points, he would have, or I think it was around that mark, would have gone down 0.6. And you can see here, he scored 30 with the driver of the day. In Singapore, a bunch of overtakes, I think it was 10 as well. And he still couldn't go up 0.6. He went down 0.6. And I think at this point of the season, like many of us are positioning for the 3x chip, you want to make sure all your assets are rising to move into those lineups. And right now, Alonso's scoring well, or I mean, scoring mixed a little bit, but you don't want to obviously run the risk of pricing yourself out of an optimal driver combination for the 3x chip. So that's obviously a consideration that needs to be made. I think there's still very much a shift towards scoring points more so than budget building at the moment, but the B tier assets are so swingy. I've got no qualms with holding Piastri while he's going through a bit of a price drop, but 0.3 is, not quite as severe as a net 0.6 swing. So if you had one A tier driver that went up 0.3 and one that went down 0.3 in Piastri and Russell's case, that's only a 0.6 swing, but it's a 1.2 swing for the B tier drivers. So I think if you're prioritizing budget building still, Alonso is tempting, but I don't think he's by any means a must get for this weekend. And then is Papaya worth the squeeze in F1 Fantasy? I think yes a little bit, but no as well. I think the Constructor is still a must-hold, best value for money asset in the game at the moment, regardless of some of their recent results, not quite up to scratch. But I think the drivers is where it's probably more of a discussion. I think Lando at his price versus what he's producing in Fantasy right now, I'm not so sure. Piastri, I think, is more of a conversation. He's going through a dip right now, but I still think value for money wise, he is a good driver to own. So, it's an interesting one. I think there's probably an argument in favor of both, but I moved him out for the sole reason of seeing more upside from someone like Max Verstappen in Singapore. There's a very possible chance I stick with that Russell Verstappen lineup in Coda, but I think if McLaren rediscover some pace, I think Piastri is the first name on my sheet for a transfer in. So just some thoughts there, but I think for me, it's buy/hold the McLaren Constructor, hold Piastri. I don't think he's a must get, and then I think you'd probably be selling Norris just based on the points per million value that you can find elsewhere. Quickly on the transfer targets, a couple of thoughts here. We've obviously talked about Mercedes already, but I'll just go through the numbers one more time. So, look, they're doing really well across the board in the last couple races, 67 scores in the back-to-back weekends. I think for me, again, the form guide suggests they're on the money, but I really want to be confident that they're worth owning in Kota. Now, I've obviously got 2 free transfers on the back of a wild card, so for me, it's probably a little harder of a decision if I come practice and sprint quali, if I want to keep them versus selling them. But personally, I don't think they're I don't think they're an instant must own. I want to see more from them in Kota. The problem is we only have one practice session, so there's limited data to go off, but obviously have that sprint quali on the Friday as well. So I think the numbers look good. They're still relatively low owned. They're producing pretty much at the same rate. If we just bring up the statistics page one more time, you can see their average score this season now tied with Red Bull and only 3 points, 2.5 points off Ferrari. So it's extremely close between the three of those constructors, but right now, the price is, I think, what's swaying a lot of people to move towards them to get to that 4A build. On Alonso, again, already talked about him a little bit, but those overtakes he racked up in Singapore now pushes him to second in the overtake leaderboard behind Oliver Behrman. But it's interesting. I want to talk about Alonso just quickly because we saw from them, Aston Martin in Zandvoort, a much slower track. They had much better downforce. Their cornering was great. They seemed to be competitive. Budapest, similar story. They weren't too bad there, but then you take them to Monza, to Baku, high-powered tracks, long straights. Doesn't seem to work for them. not very good must-sells in F1 Fantasy. And then at Singapore, a slightly slower track, more turns, more corners, not as many DRS opportunities. And that's where, again, Alonso and Stroll did very well. So we're going to a track like Circuit of the Americas where there are a lot of overtaking zones. There are some long straights, but there are also some medium speed corners, slower speed corners, which tend to suit that car. So I don't know. I don't think, again, Alonso is in go out and buy territory. I think he's monitor for free practice and sprint quali. You might find they have sections of the track they're quite competitive at, and then others that they're setting personal worsts in. So I think is probably one to watch, but I'm not saying I'm targeting him. I'm just saying he's on the radar and perhaps worth a thought, depending on how they look in free practice and sprint quali. So my early team thoughts for Coda now at the time of recording, 2 weeks away from the next deadline, but want to talk about it regardless. I think for me, the only assets that are absolute locks for staying in my team, even with 2 free transfers, are Max, Pierre Gasly, and McLaren. I mean, maybe not even Max. Definitely Pierre Gasly, because he's only 4.5 million, and McLaren. And that's simply because of the fact that the 3X chip may well be on the table in Coda. I've talked about it the last couple of weeks, about aiming potentially for this track, but after what we saw in practice in Singapore, where there was clearly not a top team, in my opinion. I mean, yes, George Russell and Max were great, but I feel like there's more upside from a McLaren driver to have the 3X on with Verstappen, for instance. So let's take a look at the team, see what we can do. Now, I set this team up specifically to position my team for the 3X, at least give myself the option to do that in Circuit of the Americas. And thanks to the price rises of George Russell going up 0.3 and Piastri going down 0.3, I can get to him and Verstappen pairing in just one move, which is exactly what I was hoping for. I thought it might even be 2 moves. It might have been a Bortoletto out and a Colapinto in to enable that. But thankfully, George winning the race and going up 0.3, it was enough to let me get to Oscar in one move. So very grateful, thankful that the strategy and planning that I put into this has paid off. I would be so okay with rolling a transfer, which sounds crazy to say for a sprint race weekend, but I'm very happy with the composition of the rest of the team. That is obviously on the proviso Mercedes continue to look good, which I think is a possibility, but I also think that, again, like I said before, Mercedes may not really be suited to this track quite like, the Ferraris, the McLarens, the Red Bulls. So, that could be in one move, a very easy swap. The alternate would be if I was to keep George, let's hypothetically say Red Bull look good. I want to get them in. I could also do that in one move. So I kind of like this flexibility depending on what team or direction I want to go down. That really leaves like the opportunity to weigh up Ferrari. Now, if that happened, again, the flexibility, that was the whole point of setting up this team the way I've set it up in Singapore, was so I can do all of these moves in 2, on the condition obviously that these 3 midfield drivers just played it safe in Singapore, which they did, thankfully. But I could do a lot of moves I want to do in 2 transfers, and I'm just very happy I can potentially do that this weekend. So it does give me flexibility. It does give me room to move depending on how free practice goes. And, obviously in some cases I've got cash left over. So, maybe Bortoletto could go out for a Liam Lawson, who I think's looked quite good recently, or at least the Racing Bulls, I should say. Even Isaac Hadjar, I wouldn't turn my nose up at a lineup like this either. So I've got options on the table. It just depends which options I obviously want to explore further. Even something like that, I could do that in 2 moves. I really like that as well. So there's flexibility, there's optionality, and realistically, that's exactly what I wanted for my wild card in Singapore. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Hopefully some early inspiration for your team lineups, but we got a little while to wait until Final Thoughts comes out next week. So as always, guys, I'm going to leave it there for now. Please show some love to the channel. But in the meantime, have a great rest of your day. I would say good luck with your teams, but I'll be back with another video before then. And I will see you all very soon.